take out your Bibles and turn to Psalm 52. Psalm 52. This is a short song, only 9 verses, but it's one of the most important songs in its contrast of the godly and the ungodly. It is all about the character of those two in terms of how each one of those groups, the ungodly or the godly, place their trust and what their perspective and attitude toward life should be. So as we look at this today, this song is critical for every one of us just as much as when David wrote it 3,000 years ago. We read in Psalm 52, "Why do you boast of evil, you mighty hero? Why do you boast all day long, you who are a disgrace in the eyes of God? You who practice deceit, your tongue plots destruction. It's like a sharpened razor. You love evil rather than good, falsehood rather than speaking the truth. You love every harmful word, you deceitful tongue. Surely God will bring you down to everlasting ruin. He will snatch you up and pluck you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living. But the righteous will see and fear. They will laugh at you, saying, 'Here now is the man who did not make God his stronghold, but trusted in his great wealth and grew strong by destroying others.' But I am like an olive tree flourishing in the house of God. I trust in God's unfailing love forever and ever. For what you have done, I will always praise you in the presence of your faithful people. And I will hope in your name, for your name is good." And the song ends there. As we jump into this study this morning, let me start by asking just a simple question, and that is, have you ever known someone who took delight in hurting others? We can go all the way back to our grade school days and remember those guys who were just bullies. They delighted in picking on smaller kids. They delighted in making people hurt and cry. It didn't stop there, did it? As those people grew older, they were more emboldened. They made themselves feel important. And even in our adult lives, we know people in our families, in our business relationships, in other areas of life who just take delight in bringing pain and struggle into other people's lives. It is so sad to me that some of those people actually achieve positions of power and authority over others. They're bosses, or they may even become kings. And history is filled with the stories of these people who are in positions of power, who are expected to do good for their employees, for their families, for the world, and yet they use that position of power as a way of bringing pain and struggle into people's lives. And that is a tragic thing. But even more tragic than just the fact that a person is in a position of authority, it is even more sad to me when you see people who are not in positions of authority but want to make themselves feel stronger and better by manipulating people, by bringing pain and struggle and hurt into their lives just so that they can feel important. We see this played out over and over throughout history. But let me give you a historical story about how two groups of people took these things that I'm talking about today and played it out in their lives. One of those people was in the 12th century. His name was King Henry II of England. Now, Henry had come to the throne as a young man, and he was spoiled. All of the things that he could enjoy, anything he wanted, he had at his disposal. As a young king, he was able to make decisions, and everybody had to jump. Now, one of the challenges that Henry was dealing with as a young king was that the Church of Rome wanted to control things that were happening in England, and Henry didn't like that. There came a crisis point when Henry was looking for a way to get out from under the authority of Rome, both politically and spiritually or religiously, and he was trying to manipulate the circumstances so that every time there was a conflict, he was going to win the argument. One of the ways that he thought would benefit himself was to elevate a young priest who was a friend of his named Thomas à Becket. He said, if I can take Becket and get him from being just an ordinary priest and put him in the position of being the Archbishop of Canterbury, then every time there is a conflict between me and Rome, Becket will take my side and we're going to win the day. Now, Becket was a good friend of his. They would go hunting together, they would stay together, and one night Henry had the talk with Thomas à Becket, and he said, listen, here's my plan. Here's what I want you to do. I'm going to recommend that you take the archbishop position, and then when Rome is telling us what to do, then we'll work together and we'll just say, forget it, we're going to do what we want. And Becket clearly knew that this was going to be a problem. And he warned Henry II, said, don't do it. Don't recommend me for this position, because as much as you like me today, you're going to hate me tomorrow, because there will be times when I have no choice but to side with Rome, and you're going to feel offended by that. No, it's not going to happen because you're on my side, right? Henry manipulated the circumstances, had Thomas à Becket raised to that position, and he was serving as the archbishop, and everything that Becket said was going to happen did happen. There were times that Rome said, here's what we want you to do. Henry disagreed. He went to Becket, and Becket said, no, this time I have to side with Rome. And Henry started getting angry. It got so bad that Thomas à Becket actually had to flee England for 6 years to keep away from Henry, because Henry was so angry with him. Finally, Becket was able to return to Canterbury as the archbishop, and Henry had a situation where he was in conflict again with Rome. He wanted to have his son serve as a co-regent, and Rome didn't like that, and so they went at odds. And in this situation, Thomas à Becket argued against Henry with Rome, and Henry had had enough. He was absolutely furious. He was with a group of his soldiers, and as they were talking about this, in a moment of absolute frustration and anger, Henry II shouted out, talking to his soldiers. He said, what sluggards, what cowards, and he was referring to them. What cowards have I brought up in my court who care nothing for their allegiance to their Lord, referring to himself. And then he asked this one question, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest, referring to Thomas à Becket. There were 4 soldiers who thought, just average soldiers, but they thought they could get in favor with the king. And as soon as the king said, who's going to rid me of this meddlesome priest? Who's going to kill à Becket? Those 4 soldiers left the king, headed straight to Canterbury. They went into the church during a worship service, and in front of all of the people, went to the altar where Thomas à Becket was serving. And in that moment, they pulled out their swords and they hacked him to death right in front of the congregation. It was a horrible, horrible situation. Horrible moment. It was horrible for what Henry wanted to do, and it was horrible that 4 soldiers who thought, we can do this and the king will be happy with us. It was horrible that these men tried to make themselves feel better, stronger, and more mighty by doing such a horrendous deed. And on December 29th, 1170, the deed was done. That's not the only time this exact scenario was played out. David describes exactly the same circumstances 3,000 years ago as he writes Psalm 52. Now, before we jump into Psalm 52, let me just point out, as I do with all of the Psalms, that there are some very unique and important things to note about the song itself if we're going to properly understand it. The first observation I've already alluded to, and that is the fact that just like last week when we were looking at Psalm 51, Psalm 52 is based on an absolute historical event. It is an event song, and we read the story about this in 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22. Now, last week when we were looking at Psalm 51, and it was all about David's sin, his rape of Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah and his repentance, the story we're looking at today, though, is not as familiar to us. And so in order to really understand the psalm, we have to step back and look at the highlights of that story. So let me just share with you from 1 Samuel 21 and 22 the highlights so that you get a better understanding of what's happening in the song that we're reading today. The title gives us some specific information. It says, when Doeg the Edomite had gone to Saul and told him that David has gone to the house of Ahimelech. Well, that's the title of the song. It tells us of the occasion, but it doesn't give us any of the details. So here are some of the details. David has fallen into disfavor with Saul. Saul is angry with David because he knows that God has chosen David to be the next king, and Saul doesn't like this idea that David will replace him. God has said, Saul, you have fallen into disfavor because you're disobedient, but David is a man after my own heart, and I'm going to give him your throne. And so now Saul is angry and wants to kill David. And David is running from Saul. David went to the town or the village called Nob, and to Ahimelech, the high priest, or the priest of that city. And Ahimelech trembled when he met David and asked him, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? This is completely odd and out of the ordinary. And Ahimelech's a little concerned. And David, in this situation, didn't want to pull Ahimelech into the problem. And so he politically manipulated the moment and he lied to Ahimelech, saying, well, the king has sent me on a mission, and he said to me, no one's supposed to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on. And Ahimelech, oh, all right, it's just between us. And Saul is out looking for David, and Saul's servant were out, and one of those servants of his, Doeg, happened to be in the town of Nob, and he was detained before the Lord. His name is Doeg the Edomite. And he has a job that he works actually for King Saul. He's one of Saul's chief shepherds. He takes care of the flocks and the herds. Not highly educated, but kind of important. And that day, David is fleeing from Saul, hiding from Saul. Saul is out looking for David with his soldiers and his officials. Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered. And Saul was seated with all of his officials standing at his side. And he said to them, is that why you've all conspired against me? Essentially, he is saying exactly the same thing Henry II said about a Becket. Oh, so you guys don't care about me. You don't love me. You're not loyal to me. You'd rather be with the other guy, right? But Doeg, the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's officials, said, well, I saw the son of Jesse. I saw David come to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him some provisions, food, and the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. And then the king sent for the priest, Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and all the men of his family who were priests at Nob. They all came to the king. They didn't know what was going on. They were innocent in all of this. And they came to Saul, and Saul said to them, why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me? Surely you will die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family. And the king ordered the guards that were at his side, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. I mean, now, can you feel the tension in the room? All these soldiers and the officials are standing right there. They're looking at Saul, who's angry with the priests. And suddenly Saul says, kill all the pastors, kill all the priests. And are you kidding? We're not going to do that. And the king's officials were unwilling to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Kill these priests for the Lord, for they are allies and conspirators with David. But Saul's men refused to kill the Lord's priests. And then Saul turns to Doeg, the chief shepherd, and he says, you do it. Doeg, okay, if they won't, I will. Doeg grabs a sword, and just like those 4 soldiers of Henry VIII in front of everybody, he starts whacking and hacking and killing every one of them. 85 priests died that day. Now, if you're like me, your first response is, well, why didn't they defend themselves? I mean, they could have stopped him. It was only Doeg that we're told was doing the hacking, and yet they just, it's not that they were pacifists. They said this, they recognized this as a moment of spiritual warfare. And they were not going to enter into the battle, and 85 priests died. And if that wasn't enough, we're told in the next set of verses, then after killing all 85 priests, Doeg went to the town of Nob, the town of the priests, and he killed the priests' families, the men, the women, the children, even the babies. It's almost incomprehensible that one man could be that evil. And then David found out what happened. Only Abiathar, one of the sons of Ahimelech, escaped and fled to David. When he told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord, David exclaimed, and David has 2 responses. Here's the first. He said, I knew it. I knew it. When I saw Doeg the Edomite there that day, I knew that he was going to tell Saul. And David's first response was to accept responsibility. He said, this was my fault. I have caused the death of all of your father's family. He was crushed. But then the second response was, it was like he went into the next room, and the brokenness and pain of that moment, he wrote Psalm 52. So we know exactly when this was written, and we know why it was written. Here's the odd part about the song, though. We know the event that initiated the writing of Psalm 52, when Doeg went, killed all the priests and their families. But what we don't fully know and understand is who is the subject of the song. As you read through, you find these descriptions of the ungodly, and so many of them represent things that are said, lies that are told. And as you're going through and comparing the details of the song with the story, we know this is the story and the historical event, but was the song written about Doeg? He didn't tell any lies. He simply told the truth. I saw David there, and then he did the horrendous deed of killing everyone. Was the song written about Saul? Again, Saul didn't lie. He was just mean and bitter and murderous. It's so interesting that one Bible teacher, J. Vernon McGee, actually writes and says, really, this song isn't about Doeg or Saul. It's about the Antichrist. This is prophetic. And I find that so interesting, whether it was written Saul, Doeg, or the Antichrist. The real point of this story isn't about the details as it is much about the nature or the character that's being described. And that's why the second major observation about this song is that it's called a maskil, a teaching song. Again, this is so important for us to understand if we're going to be able to compare the song to the story and walk away with the real understanding of why God gave us this song. This song is so important for us in relationship to character issues, not just the details that are communicated in the song and the story. The key to understanding Psalm 52 is not in the details of the story, but rather in the spirit of the song. See, Psalm 52 contrasts the heart motivations, not the details, but the heart motivations and the judgment of the ungodly against the secure hope and the trust of the righteous. That's why as we're studying, it focuses on character issues. And so because this song is a maskil, a teaching song, it's been given to all of us as a song of warning, don't be like this person, and a song of encouragement, be godly, be like the righteous, live your life this way. And then here's one last, in order for us to really fully understand, appreciate this song, the last detail I'll share with you is that this song in its structure is called a chiastic song. We've seen these before, and remember, where all of Hebrew poetry is based on the concept of parallelisms. There are all different types of parallelisms, but one of them is chiastic in structure, where you have something that's presented and then it's flipped in the next part of the song. So that what's said here is contrasted or presented in contrasting opposite form in the next part. This is how it looks. It is chiastic, and if you use the letter X to understand, you'll appreciate the flow of this song better. Now, in the first verse, we have someone who's declared to be a mighty man. He has all of this sense of self-importance, but God makes it clear in the second half of the song, this mighty man is just an ordinary man. There's nothing special, there's nothing powerful, there's nothing good about him. The second major contrast in this chiastic form is that the hurting righteous who are being attacked by this mighty man is bringing all this pain, and you might look at them and say, oh, they're down and out and they're in trouble. But this song says, no, those hurting righteous are really the ones who are on top. They're the ones who are living and blessed. So our perspective is everything. When we see ourselves as the hurting righteous, God says, no, don't see yourself under the circumstances. See yourself the way I see you. And then there's one last contrast between the ungodly and the godly. The ungodly are represented as people who will be uprooted sinners. But in dramatic contrast, the second half says, but if you live the righteous life, instead of being an uprooted sinner, you're going to be planted, vital, and green as the righteous. So now, with that big picture understanding, and I know I've gone a little longer with the introduction here than before, but all of this is necessary to really understand and appreciate the depth of this simple song that's only 9 verses long. And if we were going to look at the breakdown of how the flow of the themes is presented, there are 3 sections in Psalm 52. The first section is the gloating of the ungodly as it speaks of the nature, the character of the unrighteous. And the second section in verses 5 through 7 is the judgment of the ungodly. But then the climax of this song really comes to the end in verses 8 and 9 after looking at the nature, the gloating, and the judgment of the ungodly. It says, but here's who we are. This is what God has in store for us who are the righteous. And so let's work through this song now and the rest of our time together, and we'll start with the first section, the nature, the gloating of the ungodly in verse 4. And David comes out strong, right out of the gate with this powerful declaration when he says, "Why do you boast of evil, you mighty hero?" And the term mighty hero is really an interesting one. David is very clearly speaking with a sense of sarcasm. He's saying, you who make yourself to be so important, you who thinks of yourself as powerful and mighty. And the term that we would use today, the idiom that we would use, that David was really saying was, why do you boast and brag of all your evil, you big shot, you person who thinks you're so important? And he pushes on, he says, why do you boast? Why do you brag of evil? You mighty hero, why do you boast and brag all day long? You who are a disgrace in the eyes of God. Wow. Could you imagine what it would be like for God to point at you and say, you are nothing but a disgrace in my eyes? Whether it was Saul or Doeg that was being communicated about, written about, or whether it's a person in our own time and in our own lives, God is confronting them through the psalmist, saying, you are a disgrace and an embarrassment to heaven and a violation of everything that God desired, every reason that God allowed you to be in this position. And the most tragic part of this is that you enjoy bragging about your destructive, painful behavior. Oh, have you ever known somebody like that? Who loves to take digs and do things that bring pain and struggle into people's life, and they laugh about it. They laugh. This poem, and let's assume that he's writing about Doeg as we go through this poem points out that this kind of person who is so destructive has three primary characteristics that describe his life. The first is he is a proud man. The second, he is destructive. And the third is he doesn't need to use swords to hack and kill. He is able to be just as effective in using words as his weapons of choice. You practice deceit. The idiom that we would use for that, practicing conceit, is you're nothing but a con man. You think you're so big, you think you're so strong, but the reality is you are nothing but an empty, characterless con man. And with your tongue, you plot destruction. And your tongue is cutting and killing like a sharpened razor, a sharpened sword. I love the way that the New Living Translation communicates this verse. When it says, all day long, you do nothing but plot destruction. And your tongue cuts people like a razor. And you have become an expert at telling lies. Do you know somebody like that? Have we ever been guilty of that? Where instead of using our words to build people up, we cut them down. We use our words like a sword, a razor, and we just hack away because we can. And the heart motivation that drives this kind of person is found in verse 3. You love evil more than good. Now, you can look at this in two ways when it says you love evil more than good. You can say that this person only loves evil instead of good, or that sometimes they actually do good, but there are moments in their lives when they are under the influence of the sin nature so much that in that moment they love doing evil more than the good that they would do otherwise. and they tell lies more than speaking the truth. Now, again, this is challenging because in the story of 1 Samuel 21 and 22, no one told lies. They told the truth. But this is critical for us to understand, and I hope you'll hear this. What David is saying as he is writing Psalm 52 is that sometimes we tell lies, and that destroys people. But sometimes you can actually tell the truth with the same destructive purpose as telling a lie. And when you use the truth, oh, I'm not going to lie, but you know in telling the truth in that moment that you are using that as an opportunity to bring pain and struggle and division into people's lives. In using that moment, instead of love covering a multitude of sins or love being able to put something away, you know that you can bring pain into somebody's life. And if by telling the truth, you can do that as well as telling a lie, fine, tell the truth. But God sees them as one and the same. It's all about being destructive. That's the motivation of the heart. You love every harmful word. And even if the harm comes from telling the truth, it still is the same. Still is the same. You deceitful tongue. I think the idea is better communicated in the New Living Translation so that you understand, again, it's not just an issue of telling lies. If you tell the truth with the desire to hurt, you love to destroy others with your words. That's the real issue. And you live as a liar. The lie is that you love people. The lie is that you want their good when you know that what you're doing is only bringing harm and pain. And that can happen in our lives, in our families, in our businesses, and sadly, it can even happen in the church. There can be people who, in their moment of anger and pain, are going to use even the truth, if they can, to bring hurt and division into people's lives. And it's a horrible, tragic thing. See, folks, you have to understand, and some are probably, well, I only tell the truth. I only tell the truth. But you use the truth for your own manipulative purposes. That's why one commentator writes and says, what David is writing about here tells us something very important about the nature of falsehood, deceit, and lies, as well as the potentially murderous effect of our words. See, understand this. Words are never morally neutral. How we use our tongue is either going to bring good or it's going to bring evil. Words are never morally neutral. They are a powerful force for either evil or good. It's all in how we use them and what our purposes and our heart intent is. And Doeg used even the truth for his own manipulative, selfish purposes. And he thought by telling the truth and being involved in this situation, he would feel like a mighty man. But Derek Kidner, one of the great commentators on the Psalms, right, and said, listen, understand this. This is a heart issue. This is a character issue. The real point of Psalm 52 is the man's self-satisfaction. He feels good about himself because he was able to use this moment to hurt others and build himself up. And he thinks he's clever in the way he did it. He's absorbed in his own intrigues. Can we be honest? Have you ever done that? Have I ever done that? I'm afraid that there are times maybe we have. God says, look at the character issue that's going on here. And for that kind of person who lives and moves and delights in bringing that kind of destruction into other people's lives, we think, oh, is God going to deal with that person? And David says yes. In verses 5 through 7, he deals with the judgment of the ungodly. Now, before we look at that judgment, we got to step back for a second. Let's hit the pause button on Psalm 52, and let me remind you that when somebody in your life, whether it's in your family or at your workplace or even in our church, when somebody starts talking about you in a way and their actions are designed to bring pain and struggle and separation into your life, we all have to choose how we're going to respond. And every single one of us in this room and watching online are going to respond in our natural sense in one of 4 ways. And there is a progression that if we don't catch it and stop it, it's going to consume us. When somebody starts to bring pain and hurt into our lives, the first response is always to ignore, to suppress it, to say, oh, it doesn't matter. And we stick our head in the sand and pretend that this is, but we know that we've been hurt. We know that we've been cut, but we want to look like, oh, it's okay. But we suppress it. We ignore it. And if we don't deal with it in truth and righteousness in that moment, we are going to move to the second step. The second natural way of responding is to then to isolate ourselves from that person, and we sulk. I can't believe they did this. I can't believe they said this. I can't. And we've separated ourselves, but it's still with us. It's still in us. And if we don't address it there, it's going to push us to the third natural response, which is always to get angry. Now it starts to eat me up inside, and I am burning. I go from just a rolling boil to a hot boil, and I am so angry at this person. And now the anger becomes my filter. And everything they do is rotten and mean, and they're terrible. And I am so angry, and the anger starts to consume me. This can happen in any relationship, all the way from your marriage to some other relationship that you have where you've been hurt and you haven't dealt with this in a godly way. It's consuming you to the point where if you don't deal with it in the third step, it'll push you to the fourth, and that's revenge. I'm going to say something that's going to make them hurt the way they made me hurt. I'm going to do these little things that make digs at them, and I'm going to make them struggle and suffer the way they made me. I'm going to bring division into their life and pain the way they tried to divide us. And we are consumed by this unresolved pain. Now, the only hope for escaping this pattern of response is by God's command to just keep the long view in mind. This is a perspective issue, and we have to keep the long view. Now, understand this. When somebody has brought pain and struggle into our lives, when they've tried to divide us and they've hacked away with their words or behavior, I have to keep the long view and say, okay, God is going to deal with this. I'm going to release this to Him. I can trust God to step in and resolve this. And the driving promise for me is 2 Thessalonians 1:6. God is just. He will pay back trouble to those who trouble you. See, folks, I have said this over and over, and you have to, if you haven't written this down yet, justice delayed is not justice ignored. Justice delayed is never justice ignored. Just because we don't see God stepping in right now to make that person hurt and to deal with it the way we want God to do it, God says, Steve, just calm down, step back, and you need to trust me in this. Let this go before it consumes you. I will take care of it. And the way that God takes care of this is powerful. It is dramatic. In the next verse, we see, and there are 4 verbs that represent how God is going to bring judgment to that person's life. The four verbs are so intense, dramatic, and powerful that I want you to get an understanding of what they mean before we read the verse. So here are the four words. He says, I'm going to strike them down, and the term strike down just doesn't mean I'm going to hack their feet out from under them. It says, I am going to take their life apart. I'm going to deal with them. In fact, it is such an ultimate sense of judgment. It says, it means literally, it'll never be rebuilt. It's like tearing a house down in rubble and there's no way to rebuild it. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All of the king's horses and all the king's men, what? Couldn't put Humpty together again. That's exactly the picture that's presented about how God deals with these people. The second verb, to snatch up, is to twist like a weed. Okay, so if you've ever been weeding out in the front yard and you reach down and you just pull up a weed, sometimes it just pops off at the top, right? You don't get the root. But you know, if you twist it a bit, it might bring the root up. It'll probably bring the root up better. And that is the word that's used here. To snatch up is to twist out like God is pulling a weed out of the earth. And then he uses the word tear away, which means absolutely sweep away, like a hurricane that just sweeps away a house. That powerful a force. And the last verb that's used is uproot. And not just pull up like a weed, but it is to completely eradicate. I am going to remove their memory from the earth. Now, understanding the severity of God's judgment for those people who live with the nature of destruction, he says, this is how I'm going to destroy their lives in judgment. God will strike you down. You'll never be able to be put back together again. He's going to bring you to everlasting ruin. The phrase everlasting ruin can be properly interpreted one of two ways. It's either going to mean he will do this forever, or he's been allowing this to happen and happen and happen. Now it's time for judgment, and he's going to deal with you once and for all. But either way, it's powerful. He is going to snatch you up, like he's going to twist you out like a weed from the earth and swiftly sweep away you from your tent, or your tent completely. And then he is going to bring absolute annihilation. Your memory will be completely erased. And from the land of the living is an interesting phrase. Now, technically, we could say we've all seen people who have been these kind of men and women, and they've lived a long life. And you say, well, wait a minute, why hasn't God dealt with them? Sometimes God deals with them in this life, but God says, keep the long view. Keep the long view. Understand that if I don't deal with it in this life, justice delayed is not justice ignored. I will deal with them in the next life. And the land of the living, instead of representing this life, it refers to the next life. But God will deal with it. God will deal with it. God is a righteous judge, and he will always do right and deal with these things. And in verses 6 and 7, there is a perspective that we have that actually feels more like the next life when it says the righteous are going to see this judgment. Now, many of our Bibles use the word the righteous will see in fear, but the word fear doesn't mean terror. Here, it means they will be in awe and absolute amazement. They will laugh, not in mocking, but they're going to be just, wow! I can't believe when God deals with something, he deals with it so completely. They will laugh, saying, here's the man who did not make God his stronghold, but trusted in his great wealth and grew strong by destroying others. Now, look, if you're taking notes and you're marking your Bible, circle, underline, put a star next to the phrase, he trusted in his great wealth, because trust becomes the key word that carries us into the next section. These unsaved people trust in themselves, what they can do, how they think, and what they have for the security of their lives. They trust in themselves so that when they bring pain and division into the lives of the others, they feel pretty good about it. But that is dramatically contrasted to the hope of the righteous. And the last section of this song is now God has given us the picture and the character of the unsaved and how these people live their mean lives and how he'll deal with them. And now he says, but you have something different to look forward to. And I love the way that David does this. He writes this in emphatic terms to make sure that we understand there is a difference between the way that God will deal with us and how God will deal with these people who are mean-hearted sinners. He says, but I, and circle the word I, underline it, put a star by it. It's a dramatic contrast from them, from he. I am like an olive tree. He's been uprooted, but I've been planted, and I am thriving in the house of God. I, unlike them who trust in themselves, I trust in God's faithful love. The word faithful love is so important here. It is the Hebrew word hesed that represents God's covenant love with us. God's loyal, faithful, merciful, gracious, everything that's covered in the covenant relationship he has is found in the word hesed love. I trust in God's faithful, loyal, gracious, merciful, hesed love, both now and forever and ever. That's the critical distinction between the believer and the unbeliever. That is the heart of the character issue. I find my security in trusting God. I trust in God. And let me challenge you in your life today. When these things are happening and hurt and pain comes into your life, do you respond in the old nature or do you trust in the Lord? This song is a personal challenge of trust. And David wraps all this up by saying, for what you have done, I will always, always praise you in the presence of faithful people. And I will hope, and here's another word to underline. It's the same word as trust, but with a different nuance. Don't miss this. The word hope in this verse is the Hebrew word kavah, and it literally means to bind or tie something together. And the point is, when you and I have our lives bound to God, when we are tied to him so that he becomes our trust, we are absolutely secure in him and we will be blessed. There is no other way to experience the outpouring of God's blessing than to be tied to him in trust. The moment I'm untied from him, I become self-secure and self-sufficient, and I end up messing up. And I'm not blessed. But as long as I am tied to him, I am tied to your name. The name represents the nature and the character of God himself. We could take everything that we've been looking at in Psalm 52 and say that David summarizes this whole issue of the difference in the nature and the character of unbelievers versus believers in the verse of Psalm 20, verse 7. Some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, some trust in their own manipulative behavior, some trust in their great wealth, and they're going to end in a terrible, tragic way. But we're not like that. We trust in the Lord. We trust in the Lord. When pain comes into your life, when people try to hurt and are destructive, you can either respond in the old nature or you can trust in the Lord. I trust in the Lord. And if you choose to put your trust in the Lord, let me close with this powerful reminder. God tells us in Psalm 2, verse 12, blessed, blessed, happy, fulfilled, complete. Blessed are all who put their trust in him. Where is your trust today? When people attack you with their words or their behavior, when they delight in bringing pain and struggle into your life, do you respond by trusting in yourself to deal with it, or do you trust in the Lord? I trust in the Lord. I'm going to ask you to bow your heads for just a moment. I don't know what's going on in your life right now. But maybe you're in the middle of this and there's somebody, it may be a family member, a coworker, or even somebody in the church who has said things or done things to hurt you, and you're just in the middle of this right now. And God is saying, give this thing to me, release it, and you trust me. You trust me, and I will bless you. And right now, you're just saying, Steve, you have no idea. This was exactly what God wanted me here today, and I need you to pray for me. And I want to pray for you. And with no one looking around, if you're in the middle of this and you'd say, Steve, would you just pray for me today? Just raise your hand and let me pray for you. Yep. All around the room. Yep, I see. All right. Anyone else? I'm really hurting right now. I'm really struggling. I need God to bless me as I give this to him. All right? Father, look, you see the hands. And even more, you know our hearts, and you know what we're going through, and you know the pain that some of us feel right now because others have chosen a lifestyle of destructive behavior, destructive words. And God, right now, we're giving that person in this situation to you, each one of us, saying, God, take this. You deal with it. I don't want to deal with it. It's consuming me. And I'm asking you to bless me as I trust in you. Thank you that you are a trustworthy God. We love you. And we are so grateful for your Hesed covenantal love that covers us and carries us. So we place our trust in you as we do this gladly and in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.